Alright, hi, I'm Rebecca Long, and I'll be responding to the claim that fighting the war on terror by means of torture in the interrogation process is ineffective. Now, it might be kind of an amphibole, haha, on his part per se, but I assume that Jonathan meant that torture is ineffective for producing information in the interrogative process. Now, I'm sure most of you people know about the controversies on whether torture is ethical or whether it's lawfully accepted, and that's completely fine for a argumentation about value. But the question is it effective? Jonathan gives perfectly good explanations, such as the Abu Ghraib scandal, the pictures, and the Human Rights Declaration about why it might be taboo, why it might be unaccepted, but he failed to prove again, as I said earlier, that the torture is ineffective. So I'll start by refuting some of his points, and then I will give a counterclaim showing that despite the taboos, it is effective in gaining information. First, in his introduction, Jonathan mentions the movie Road to Guantanamo Bay, which is supposedly a first-hand account by 3 people who have been through it and all that stuff. But the problem to this is that it is a movie. I've watched the movie myself. Yes, I spent 2 hours watching it. And there are points where the interview process is like cut off, kind of fractionated. And it raises questions in my mind whether all the information was in context. And as it is a movie, I mean, some of the points have to be sensationalized to make it interesting to an audience. And another question I have is, why doesn't the movie elaborate on how they got captured, and why would the 3 friends put themselves in danger by going over to a war zone right after 9/11? Just doesn't quite make sense to me. The second point that he raised was the Geneva Convention and the Army documents stating that torture is unaccepted. Well, I did some research on the Geneva Convention, and Article 4 caught my attention. The wording in the document defines prisoners of war. It says, among many other criteria, that they have to be carrying arms openly and conducting operations in accordance with laws and customs of war. Now, this is kind of ambiguous. Does it mean that if all these criteria aren't followed, that they aren't considered a prisoner of war or aren't considered lawful combatants? Or also, what are the customs of war they speak about? This document seems to be rather subject to interpretation. A third point that Jonathan brings up, which does sound pretty good despite the not adhering to effectiveness, is the fiscal spending on the prison camps. He claims that $118 million is spent just in a year for maintaining these prison camps. However, fiscal spending on prison camps is much less than other government spending. I did research on a government website from the U.S. Department of Commerce for 2007, and $5.4 billion was spent on the prisons just in our country, not even the prison camps, just our normal prisons for keeping, rapists and drug offenders, such things as those. Another thing it said was $1.3 billion was spent on the Office of Federal Detention Trustees, and several hundreds of million were spent on prevention programs for these drug offenders, sex offenders, and such. Also, in a pie chart on the same website, only 16.8% of the budget was for defense, was spent on defense for these prisons, like these terrorist prison camps and such. Now I will present to you my reasons for why torture methods are effective in collecting information, whether fortunately or unfortunately. My first example is a video by Discovery Channel, sponsored by Discovery Channel, a show called Mythbusters, and they were doing a documentary on waterboarding. And all their staff, despite being in a comfortable position and knowing that they can get out of it at any time, having their friends there to support them, they could not stand more than 2 hours of waterboarding, which waterboarding can be defined as many things, but in Mythbusters it was they were put down and had water dripped on their head constantly for the amount of time that they could stay in there, which proves that, you know, despite, even if it's not something that causes bodily harm, just such a simple thing as water being dripped on your head can cause a person to divulge information. And even such simple things can be described as torture. Another one was from the Washington Post by Dana Priest and Barton Gelman, editors for the Washington Post, and they said, Abu Zubaydah, who is believed to be the most important al-Qaeda member in detention, was shot in the groin during his apprehension by selectively using painkillers, meaning that either they didn't give him as many or they didn't give it to him when he wanted them. He is now said to be cooperating, and his information has led to the apprehension of other important al-Qaeda members. Another example of how torture does work is from the same Washington Post article, but it was by retired Army General Wayne Downing. He said that while they were giving evidence, they fabricated and weaved in threads of information that went nowhere. But even with these ploys, we still got valuable information from their testimonies, which proves that even though they might lie in some parts of their torture investigations, even though the prisoners might lie, from those lies they can pick out the information that is important and capture certain al-Qaeda members. And I hope on my presentation it's proved to you that torture, fortunately or unfortunately, is effective in gaining information.
Yeah, it's a little overtime, a couple of minutes. There are a couple places that you could cut down on things. For instance, you get into the discussion about the prison costs, and you spend quite a bit of time giving us a whole bunch of numbers about domestic spending on prisons and so on and so forth. I think a single comparison on that would have been enough, and that would have shortened things up. On the effectiveness of torture and gaining information, you can get through those examples a little bit more quickly. I'm not sure that the Mythbusters one gets you very much, but the other two I think are a little bit more practical because they're context relevant. Your argument is about effectiveness versus ineffectiveness, and I think there's good reasoning in the presentation about why the advocate's claims don't really address the question of effectiveness but deal with some value issues, and I think those are pretty reasonable points that you explained. All right.